June 6, 1944. Normandy, France. 5,000 Allied vessels churned the English Channel into froth as dawn broke over a coastline bristling with concrete and steel. Among the 156,000 troops preparing to storm Fortress Europe, one man stood apart, not because of his rank or his regiment, but because of what he carried in a small leather pouch tied to his belt. Private Samuel Nakai of the 45th Infantry Division, a Chiricahua Apache from the mesas of Arizona, was about to prove that the oldest warfare techniques could defeat the newest military engineering. What German commanders believed to be an impregnable defensive position would fall without a single explosive, without a gunshot heard, and without the defenders ever seeing their attacker until it was far too late. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Samuel Nakai accomplished that day would force military strategists to reconsider everything they thought they knew about modern combat, proving that 5,000 years of indigenous survival knowledge could outsmart reinforced concrete, observation slits, and interlocking fields of fire. The landing at Utah Beach had not gone according to plan for Dog Company, 2nd Battalion. Strong currents had pushed their landing craft nearly 2,000 meters south of the intended zone, depositing them in a sector where German resistance remained fierce and organized. Lieutenant Morrison, their commanding officer, had already been carried back to the beach with injuries sustained from defensive obstacles. By mid-afternoon, the company found itself pinned down in a drainage ditch 300 meters from a bunker complex that dominated the only viable route inland. The fortification was a masterwork of military engineering. Constructed from reinforced concrete nearly 2 meters thick, it commanded a clear view of the approaches across open farmland. Intelligence reports indicated it housed a crew of 8 to 10 defenders operating a heavy weapon and several support arms. Multiple previous attempts to advance had been turned back. Artillery support was unavailable, the naval guns had shifted their focus to targets farther inland, and the few available field pieces were desperately needed elsewhere along the rapidly expanding beachhead. Sergeant William Chen, now the senior NCO with the unit, gathered his squad leaders in the muddy depression that provided their only cover. The map spread before them showed the tactical nightmare they faced. 300 meters of exposed ground, perfectly observed from elevated positions. No cover, no concealment, no indirect fire support available. "We've got engineers coming up with Bangalore torpedoes," Chen said, his voice tight with frustration. "But they're tied up clearing obstacles at the beach. Could be hours, could be tomorrow. Division wants this road open by nightfall." Private First Class Robert Martinez, who had landed beside Nakai that morning, looked at his friend. "Sam's been studying that bunker for the past hour. He's got that look." Chen turned to Nakai, who had been sitting quietly, his eyes moving between the fortification and the terrain. "Private, if you've got observations, now's the time." Nakai shifted his position carefully, keeping below the sightlines. "The ground between here and there isn't as flat as it looks, Sergeant. There's a depression, maybe half a meter deep, that runs from that destroyed farmhouse about 200 meters to the northwest, probably an old drainage line. Follows the natural contour." Chen squinted at the landscape. To him, it looked uniformly flat and uniformly fatal. "Even if there is, you'd still be exposed for the final 100 meters. "Not necessarily," Nakai replied. He reached down and scooped up a handful of the Norman soil, a mixture of clay, silt, and decomposed vegetation. He worked it between his fingers, testing its consistency. "This is good earth, holds moisture well. With the right preparation, a man could cross that ground in full daylight, and they wouldn't see him until he was close enough to touch their walls." The statement hung in the air. Several of the men exchanged glances that mixed skepticism with desperate hope. Chen had served with Native American soldiers before, Navajo code talkers mostly, and had learned to take their tactical assessments seriously, no matter how unconventional they seemed. "Explain," Chen said simply. Nakai began mixing water from his canteen with the soil, creating a thick paste. "My grandfather taught me this when I was 6 years old learning to hunt. You don't just hide from what you hunt. You become part of the land itself. The deer doesn't see camouflage patterns. It sees things that don't belong. shapes that break the natural flow, movement that doesn't match the wind. He continued working the mud, adding bits of grass and small plant matter. The German defenders are trained to spot soldiers. They're looking for helmets, uniforms, weapons, human silhouettes. They're watching for movement patterns that match how soldiers move, but they're not looking for the ground itself to move. Private James Morrison, no relation to the wounded lieutenant, spoke up. "You're talking about crawling 300 meters through mud." "Not crawling," Nakai corrected. "Flowing, the way water moves across land, the way shadows shift when clouds pass. Slow enough that the eye doesn't register it as movement at all." He gestured to the bunker. "They've been watching this field since they built that position. They know every bush, every rock, every feature. What they don't know is that the ground itself can change, slowly, naturally, in ways that don't trigger alarm." Chen was beginning to understand. "You're talking about covering yourself completely, head to toe." "More than that," Nakai said. "I'm talking about becoming a feature of the landscape, not a man covered in mud, but a slightly different contour of the earth itself. And I'm talking about moving so slowly that their eyes slide right past me, the same way you don't notice a shadow lengthening as the sun moves." The tactical audacity of the plan was either brilliant or suicidal, and Chen couldn't immediately determine which. "How close would you need to get?" "Close enough to understand their routine, close enough to wait for the right moment, close enough to enter through the rear access point without them knowing I'm there until I'm inside." Nakai's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. "Bunkers like that, they're designed to defend against frontal assault, but they have vulnerabilities, supply entries, ventilation systems, observation blind spots created by their own firing angles," Martinez interjected. "Sam, that's insane. Even if you make it across—" "I'll make it across," Nakai said quietly. "My people have been making ourselves invisible to prey and enemies for more generations than anyone's been building concrete boxes. The question isn't whether I can reach it. The question is whether you trust me to finish it once I'm there." Chen studied the young private's face. Nakai had been in his unit for only 3 months, transferred from another division. His service record was exemplary but unremarkable. He followed orders, did his job, caused no trouble. But Chen had noticed details others missed. The way Nakai could move through brush without making a sound. The way he seemed to sense enemy positions before visual confirmation. Skills that didn't come from basic training. "What would you need?" Chen asked. "Time, patience, and for everyone to stop watching me once I start," Nakai replied. "The defenders will be nervous. They'll be watching for attacks. If they see a dozen men staring at one spot in the field, they'll focus there too. You need to give them other things to worry about. Make noise to the left. Show movement to the right. Keep their attention divided and jumping." The plan that emerged over the next 30 minutes was unlike anything in the tactical manuals. While Nakai prepared himself, the remaining members of Dog Company would conduct careful, limited demonstrations along other parts of the line. Nothing aggressive enough to draw concentrated fire, but enough to keep the defenders scanning their entire perimeter. Enough to make them tired, jumpy, uncertain. Nakai began his preparation with methodical precision. He removed his helmet, his jacket, anything with sharp angles or recognizable military features. He kept his rifle and a combat knife, but wrapped them in cloth torn from a discarded shelter half, obscuring their distinctive shapes. Then he began applying the mud. This wasn't simply smearing dirt on skin. Nakai was sculpting. He built up layers on his shoulders and back, creating gentle slopes that would blend with ground contours. He filled in the hollows of his collarbones and neck, eliminating the shadows that create human recognition patterns. He paid particular attention to his hands and face, not just covering them, but texturing them with grass fragments and small pieces of vegetation that would break up any remaining outline. Martinez watched in fascination as his friend transformed. "You really learned all this hunting deer?" "Deer, antelope, sometimes predators," Nakai replied, working mud into his hair until it became an amorphous, earth-toned mass, but also avoiding other hunters, other tribes. Later avoiding soldiers when my people were being rounded up. This isn't sport technique. This is survival knowledge passed down through generations who had to be invisible to stay alive. When he finished, Nakai no longer looked like a soldier covered in camouflage. He looked like a piece of the landscape that had somehow gained the power of movement. His outline had been completely disrupted. The human proportions were gone, replaced by irregular contours that could have been a small bush, a rock formation, or just a variation in the terrain. "How long?" Chen asked. Nakai looked at the sun, calculating. "If I start now, I'll be in position by late afternoon. Once I'm close, I'll need to observe their patterns. Wait for the right moment. Could be an hour, could be longer." "We need that position neutralized before dark," Chen said. "Once the sun sets, we lose what little advantage we have." "Understood, Sergeant." Nakai checked his wrapped rifle one final time, ensuring nothing would catch light or create a recognizable silhouette. "One more thing. When it happens, when you see the result, wait 5 minutes before moving. Give me time to secure the position and signal that it's clear." Chen nodded. "What's the signal?" "You'll know it," Nakai said. "Trust me, there won't be any ambiguity." At 1400 hours, Private Samuel Nakai began his impossible journey. He didn't move toward the bunker. He settled into the earth at the edge of the drainage ditch and became utterly still. So still that after 5 minutes, men who had watched him begin found their eyes sliding past his position, unable to precisely locate him even though they knew exactly where he'd started. 10 minutes passed. 15. To the untrained observer, nothing was happening. But Nakai was moving, millimeters at a time, his body flowing like water finding its path through soil. He moved only when the wind moved, using the rustling of grass to mask any tiny sounds his passage might create. He moved only when the defenders were looking elsewhere, using the demonstrated activity from other positions to pull their attention away. The drainage depression he'd identified was real, but subtle, the kind of terrain feature that's invisible until you understand what you're looking for. Nakai poured himself into it, becoming part of its contour, following its gentle curve toward the northwest, where the destroyed farmhouse provided a psychological focal point that would draw enemy observation away from the apparently empty ground. 20 meters. 30. The progress was agonizing to watch for those few who could still track his position, but from the bunker's perspective, nothing was moving. The field remained empty. The constant, low-level activity from other American positions kept their attention fragmented and jumping. Sergeant Chen orchestrated the distraction with careful precision. A few shots fired from one position, movement visible in another, a call for a medic, loud enough to hear but not so dramatic as to seem staged. Each action calculated to maintain pressure without provoking a major response, to keep the defenders alert but not focused, to make them tired without making them desperate. 50 meters. Nakai had been moving for nearly an hour and had covered less than a sixth of the distance. His muscles screamed from maintaining contorted positions, from moving with such excruciating slowness, that each centimeter forward required absolute physical control. But this was the part that couldn't be rushed. This was where modern military training failed and ancient discipline proved its worth. Any soldier could learn to charge a position. Very few could learn to move so slowly that movement itself became invisible. The sun tracked across the sky. In the bunker, the defenders were experiencing their own kind of tension. They'd successfully repelled multiple advances that morning. They knew reinforcements were unlikely. They knew the invasion force was enormous. They knew, with the certainty of professional soldiers, that their position would eventually be overwhelmed. The question was only when and how. They watched the field, they watched the tree lines. They watched the distant beach where the seemingly endless flow of Allied forces continued. They saw the demonstrations along their perimeter, signs of an enemy probing for weakness, testing for opportunities. What they didn't see was the slow transformation of a small section of Earth roughly 120 meters northwest of their position. By 1500 hours, Nakai had covered 150 meters. He was past the midpoint, entering the zone where detection would mean certain death. There was no cover here, no possibility of retreat. His entire existence had narrowed to the immediate few centimeters before his face, to the sound of wind in grass, to the rhythm of patient, invisible progress. Inside the bunker, Corporal Heinrich Stern was experiencing the particular fatigue that comes from sustained vigilance. He'd been on duty since 0400 hours, 6 hours before the first landing craft reached the beaches. His eyes ached from scanning the same terrain for 11 hours. He'd seen comrades in other positions overrun. He'd watched the systematic destruction of carefully prepared defenses, and he'd maintained his post because that was what training demanded and duty required. He swept his binoculars across the field again. Empty. The same scattered debris from earlier fighting, the same contours of Norman farmland. His attention shifted to movement on the left flank. American soldiers doing something near the tree line, probably preparing another probe. His hand moved toward the communication tube that would alert the crew to prepare for possible action. 200 meters away, Nakai froze. He'd seen the glint of binocular lenses turning toward his section of the field. He became stone. Not just still, truly inanimate, every muscle locked, breathing so shallow as to be imperceptible. He waited as the scan passed over him, as eyes that were looking for threats found only earth and grass. Then, with infinite patience, he resumed the microscopic progress. 200 meters, 220. The sun was lower now, creating longer shadows and subtle changes in the light that actually worked in Nakai's favor. What might have been suspicious in harsh midday sun became just another shadow gradient in late afternoon. His body temperature, elevated from hours of isometric tension, matched the sun-warmed earth closely enough that the heat signature difference was negligible. At 1600 hours, Nakai reached the 250-meter mark. He was close enough now to hear voices from the bunker, indistinct but clearly present, close enough to smell the concrete dust and gun oil, close enough to begin understanding the position's specific configuration. The bunker was larger than it had appeared from distance. The main structure was indeed formidable, but there was a secondary entrance, less a door than a covered crawlway that provided access to what was likely a supply room or emergency exit. This was the vulnerability Nakai had anticipated. Fortifications designed to withstand frontal assault often had rear access points that were protected more by their obscured location than by their inherent strength. But he couldn't approach directly. Not yet. Now came the most difficult part, positioning himself within striking range while remaining invisible during the hours when defenders would be most alert, watching for twilight attacks when reduced visibility might favor the attackers. Nakai settled into a slight depression 20 meters from the bunker's rear aspect. To anyone looking at that spot, it appeared to be a small, irregular hummock, possibly a shell crater partially filled in, or just natural terrain variation. Nothing that warranted attention, nothing that suggested threat. And there he waited, not sleeping, but entering a state his grandfather had taught him, a form of conscious rest where the mind remained alert, but the body released all unnecessary tension. He'd once waited 18 hours in this state while hunting, becoming so much a part of the landscape that birds had landed on his back. Inside the bunker, the defenders were changing shifts. Stern was relieved by a younger soldier, Private Klaus Weber, who was fresh enough to be vigilant but inexperienced enough to lack the pattern recognition that might have noticed subtle changes in the field. The crew settled into evening routine, quick meals, equipment checks, the small rituals that maintain readiness during extended duty. The sun lowered further. Chen and his men maintained their careful pressure, but they were running out of time. If Nakai hadn't succeeded by dark, they'd have to attempt a conventional assault with all the casualties that implied. Chen found himself staring at the field, trying to spot the Apache scout, and failing completely. He had to trust that the plan was still in motion. At 1730 hours, as the sun touched the horizon, Nakai made his assessment. The defenders had relaxed slightly with the approaching darkness. They believed the dangerous hours for attack were passing, that any assault would wait for full dark or the next day. This was the moment. He moved the final 20 meters in absolute silence. Not silence as soldiers understood it, the elimination of major noise. But the silence his people had perfected, the complete absence of sound that triggers alarm. His breathing matched the wind. His movements synchronized with the settling sounds of cooling metal and shifting earth that accompanied sunset. The rear entrance was covered by a steel plate that was secured from inside but not locked. It was designed for emergency egress, not defense. Nakai positioned himself beside it and listened. He could hear voices clearly now, 4 distinct speakers, maybe 5. He heard the working of a weapons mechanism being checked. He heard someone mention being relieved in 2 hours. He waited for the right convergence of factors. The wind picked up slightly, creating ambient noise. Inside, someone was describing something that generated laughter. Attention would be diverted, awareness lowered. The light was fading, making the interior of the bunker dimmer, less likely to immediately reveal an intruder in the shadows. Nakai's hand moved to the access plate. He applied pressure gradually, testing the mechanism. It had some resistance but wasn't stuck. He continued applying force, so slowly that the metal's movement was silent. The friction distributed across minutes rather than seconds. The plate opened. A dark space beyond, leading into the bunker's rear compartment. Nakai flowed through the opening like water, low and silent, letting the plate close behind him with the same gradual control. He was inside. In the shadows of an ammunition storage area, perhaps 3 meters from where the crew maintained their position. He could see them now through an interior opening. 5 men, their attention focused forward on the observation slits and firing positions. This was the moment Nakai's entire life had prepared him for. Not the killing, though he was prepared to do that if necessary, but the understanding of space, of awareness, of how attention works and where it fails. The defenders were looking outward, their entire psychology oriented toward external threat. The idea that something could be behind them, in what they perceived as their secured space, was literally unthinkable. Nakai moved through that blind spot in their awareness like a shadow at noon. 2 steps brought him within arm's reach of the nearest defender. His hand moved to the man's shoulder, his voice quiet but commanding in the soldier's native language, a phrase taught to him during training that meant, "Make no sound, you are secured, your war is over." The shock was total. The soldier's weapon clattered to the floor, and in the 2 seconds it took his companions to turn, Nakai had already pivoted to a position where his own wrapped rifle commanded the interior space. His voice, still quiet but carrying absolute authority, repeated the phrase. 5 weapons lowered, 5 pairs of hands rose. The entire fortification, the impregnable bunker that had resisted hours of assault, had fallen without a shot fired, without an alarm raised, without the defenders ever seeing their attacker until he was already among them. Nakai gestured them toward the rear compartment, keeping his rifle trained, but his finger off the trigger. These men were no longer combatants, they were prisoners, whose war had ended in the most psychologically devastating way possible. They'd been beaten not by superior firepower, but by becoming irrelevant to their own defense. Once they were secured in the rear area, Nakai moved to the main observation slit. He carefully removed the white cloth he'd wrapped around his rifle and waved it through the opening. 3 slow sweeps. The signal to Chen. On the American line, Martinez was the first to see it. "There! Sergeant! The bunker!" Chen raised his binoculars, hardly daring to believe. The white flag emerged again, this time accompanied by a figure becoming visible, Nakai, still covered in dried mud, looking more like an earth spirit than a human soldier. 5 minutes, Chen reminded his men, though he could feel their desire to rush forward. Give him the time he asked for. When Dog Company finally moved forward, they found the bunker secured and 5 bewildered prisoners sitting with their backs against the concrete wall. Nakai was cleaning his rifle, methodically removing the cloth wrapping and checking the mechanism. "Jesus, Sam," Martinez said, staring at his friend. "I watched you the whole time and I still lost you halfway across." Chen examined the position with professional appreciation. An intact bunker with its weapons and ammunition stores completely intact. No casualties on either side. A strong point neutralized without depleting their own resources. It was, from a purely tactical standpoint, perfect. "How?" Chen asked simply. Nakai looked up from his rifle. "They were watching for soldiers. I stopped being a soldier. They were watching for movement. I stopped moving the way humans move. They were watching for threats from outside their fortress. I entered their fortress from where they weren't watching." One of the prisoners, the corporal who had been on duty for most of the day, spoke in hesitant English. I looked at that field 100 times. You could not have crossed it. It is impossible. It's impossible for someone crossing a field, Nakai replied, but I didn't cross the field. I became part of it. The tactical report that reached division headquarters that evening was remarkable for its brevity and its implications. Dog Company had secured Objective Baker, the designated bunker complex, without casualties and without expenditure of significant ammunition or explosives. The method was described as innovative infiltration technique utilizing specialized individual skills, but the real report spread through the ranks in the way that extraordinary events always do. The story of the Apache scout who disappeared in an open field and reappeared inside an enemy fortification became the kind of tale that soldiers told each other in the quiet hours, the kind of story that reminded them that war was not just about machines and explosives, but about human capability at its most refined edge. For the German prisoners, the experience was deeply unsettling in ways that conventional defeat was not. They'd been prepared to fight and potentially die defending their position. They'd been prepared to be overwhelmed by numbers or firepower. What they weren't prepared for was to simply become irrelevant, to have their fortress, their weapons, their training, all made meaningless by an approach they'd never conceived as possible. Weber, the young private who had been on duty when Nakai reached the bunker, would later describe the experience to interrogators. We were vigilant. We followed all protocols, we watched constantly, and yet he was simply there as if the earth itself had risen up against us. How do you defend against that? The answer, of course, was that you couldn't. Not in that moment, not with that approach, not when 5,000 years of survival knowledge met 20th century fortification design and found the gap between them. Nakai's achievement rippled through military thinking in ways both immediate and long-lasting. In the immediate term, other Native American soldiers with similar traditional knowledge were consulted on tactical problems, their perspectives integrated into operational planning. Scout teams began incorporating techniques that prioritized invisibility over camouflage, movement patterns that broke conventional military doctrine but proved devastatingly effective. In the longer term, Nakai's success became part of the foundation for what would later be called unconventional warfare doctrine, the recognition that traditional indigenous knowledge represented sophisticated tactical systems that could complement modern military capabilities. The understanding that sometimes the solution to advanced defensive technology wasn't more advanced offensive technology, but rather an entirely different conceptual approach. Nakai himself remained characteristically modest about the achievement. When Martinez asked him that evening how it felt to have accomplished the impossible, he replied with a slight smile, "My grandfather could have done it faster, and he would have been disappointed that it took me so long. But there was more truth in that statement than simple humility. What Nakai had demonstrated wasn't a unique personal ability. It was the product of a knowledge system, a way of understanding relationship with land and awareness that his culture had developed and refined over countless generations. He was simply one person who had maintained that knowledge and found a use for it in circumstances his ancestors could never have imagined." The 5 German prisoners were processed through the normal channels and eventually ended up in a camp in southern England. Years later, Corporal Stern would return to that day in interviews, still struggling to reconcile what had happened. "I have thought about it many times," he said, "trying to understand what we missed, what we could have done differently. But I think perhaps we were defending against the wrong threat. We were prepared for the war we understood. He brought a different kind of war, one our training never conceived." Private Samuel Nakai survived the war and returned to Arizona, where he lived quietly, rarely speaking about his military service. He taught his own children the skills his grandfather had taught him, not as combat techniques, but as a way of understanding the world, of seeing relationships and patterns that others missed. He worked as a guide, teaching others to read the landscape, to move through it with respect and understanding. On the few occasions when he was asked about that day in Normandy, he would acknowledge the facts but redirect attention to the broader lesson. "People think of indigenous knowledge as primitive," he said once, "as if we were simply less advanced versions of modern people. But knowledge is knowledge, understanding is understanding. My people survived for thousands of years, in landscapes that would kill an unprepared person in days. That survival required sophisticated understanding of environment, awareness, patience, and technique. That I was able to apply those techniques in a modern war doesn't make them less ancient. It makes them timelessly relevant. The bunker itself stood for several more years before being demolished in post-war reconstruction. But the memory of what happened there, the impossible crossing, the silent infiltration, the bloodless capture, became part of the oral history of the units that fought in Normandy. A reminder that innovation doesn't always mean advancement, that sometimes the wisest path forward is to remember what was known before, and that the human capacity for adaptation and ingenuity remains the most powerful weapon in any arsenal. The tactical principles Nakai demonstrated that day, the understanding of awareness patterns, the use of expectation as a vulnerability, the application of patient incremental progress toward an impossible goal, these became studied elements of military doctrine. But they also represented something deeper, the recognition that human knowledge exists in many forms, that traditional and indigenous ways of knowing represent sophisticated systems of understanding, and that dismissing them as primitive reveals the limitations of the dismisser, not the dismissed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.